Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of our course. The next couple of weeks, we're really going to be focusing in depth on this concept of transition assessments and why they're so important. So this week, we'll kind of do an overview of transition assessments, and then next week, we'll get more into the weeds of what transition assessments that are out there and how we apply those to specific students. And then we'll talk about how we summarize those transition assessments too. But first, I wanted to kind of walk you through this week's Canvas course. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we're all clear on kind of what I want you to pay attention to this week. And so please take a minute to just read the introduction and the objectives for this week's course. And then in terms of what you are going to be accountable for reading is these 2 case studies. So I've provided one of a student named Mary, who is a high school student with a learning disability. And then I have an older student, Lizette, who is a student with a more complex need. So kind of depending upon, your focus and your settings, are you working with students with more complex needs? Go ahead and, read Lizette. That might be more relevant to what you are experiencing in your settings. Or Mary. The examples I'm going to use through this week and next week will both mostly be centered around Mary. And so you might want to read both. But anyway, and then I'm going to really walk through this transition assessment Padlet. So it's essentially like a toolkit. So it's something that we put together at the State Board of Education where we tried to organize all many different types of transition assessments, and most of the ones that are on there are free. So that doesn't mean that those are the only ones you can use. Lots of people use different ones. Lots of districts have purchased transition curriculum. So, that's certainly up to you and your setting and the folks that you work with in your schools. But we wanted to provide a variety of assessments on this Padlet. So I'll do a Padlet walkthrough after I kind of finish the lecture today. And then the supplemental readings, of course, these are optional, but great resources. So the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, that's what NTACT means, has put out their own toolkit. So similar to the one that is on the Padlet that we have created at the state, they have a national one. So take a look at that. And then there's kind of this in-depth student progress monitoring toolkit, which really kind of walks you through this in-depth process of how to administer transition assessments and summarize them and why they're important. And we'll talk a lot about that today as well. And then the 2 other ones are Indiana and the state of Illinois have kind of set up some other pretty cool transition assessment toolkits. One of them is like a matrix where you can click on the age of the student, the disability category of the student, and then it suggests certain transition assessments to use. So that's the Indiana one. So those are pretty cool as well. So I just wanted to kind of walk you through this week's reading. And now I'm going to stop sharing and we will get to the slides and talk about the introduction to transition assessments and why they are so important. They really are the foundation of a compliant and meaningful and quality transition plan for a student. So let me get this slide going. All right, so yes, we're going to talk about why are transition assessments so important and what really is the goal around transition assessments. So really the ultimate goal to make sure that we're doing a really nice job with assessing students in the area of transition is really to help students develop their own view of who they are and their future roles. So a lot of people will ask me, well, if I'm working with younger students like junior high students, they're not ready to talk about careers yet. So how do we, what do we use for transition assessments? And really it's about getting students to kind of discover themselves. So it's a lot of discovery around maybe their learning styles, their preferences, their interests, what they're good at. Maybe they're good at things that are not necessarily academic, and we don't always examine that at school. So that's where transition assessments really come in, is not only you getting a really nice picture of where your student is and where they need to go, but for the students themselves to really understand their own unique interests, talents, preferences, and their needs, and how that will relate to their future, whether that be, going out to college, employment, all of those things, independent living. So the success of post-secondary transition assessment really depends mostly on the student's perspective. So it's important that we want to include the student in this process. Now, you might be saying, well, I work with students with really complex needs. How are we going to do this? That might look a little different, and we'll talk about that, but we always want to make sure that we are student-centered and focused. So we kind of explain transition assessments around this concept of like building a house, right? So we can't build a house without having a really strong foundation. And that really is what transition assessments are. They are the cornerstone or the foundation of a quality transition plan. So if we don't have a way to gather really rich information around a student, then we can't develop a really appropriate and quality plan for them around transition. So we want to always remember that we want student voice to come through. The student really is sort of the architect of their transition plan, right? They're the ones that this plan is about them. This is about their future, what they want to do, the skills that they need, the experiences that they need, their preferences, their interests. Again, we're going to talk about spins a whole lot through this process. So keep that in mind, that it is so important that we involve the student and the family as well. We'll talk about that too in more depth. And also, again, remember, compliance is just kind of that setting the bar really low, and we want to go beyond that. If we develop a meaningful post-secondary transition plan that are based on this rich assessment data, then we're going way beyond compliance, and we're really helping that student achieve that dream, right? And that aspiration of what they're going to do in their life after school. So this will look familiar to you from week 1, but beginning with the end in mind. So I'm going to use this colorful flow chart a lot during this semester. And the reason for that is, again, remember the transition plan, even though it's just a page and a half embedded in the IEP, it's so much more than that. It's a process, and this is the process. Starting with that top gray box that's circled where it says meaningful student participation. So we want to keep that in mind through the whole process. And the orange box up there is really where we start this whole process, which is around this idea of gathering current information through using transition assessments to really pull out those students' spins. And you can see the little yellow boxes under the big orange box are those spins: strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. So that'll be a huge theme throughout this. But first and foremost, I want to just make really clear what are the state law requirements around transition assessment. So if we were to come and look at your IEPs and pull the transition plan, what would you need for basic compliance? And really what the law says is that those students have post-secondary goals, and we're going to get into that in more depth, but that's a requirement. They have to have a post-secondary goal for further education and training after high school, and they have to have a post-secondary goal for what they'll do for employment, and then one for independent living if that's appropriate for the student. And all of those goals, those 2 or 3 goals that are required, have to be based on those age-appropriate transition assessments. So we have to see alignment between what are the assessments saying, and does that connect directly to that student's post-secondary goals. So what is needed? Well, first and foremost, we talked last week about how this has to be in place when the student is 14 at their IEP meeting. So if we were to look at a transition plan, we would identify immediately, is the student 14 or older? If so, then there must be some evidence that there was current transition assessments conducted prior to the IEP meeting with that student. And how would we recognize that evidence? Well, there's a couple of choices. One, we would look to see if the IEP had a PLAFUP, or a present level of academic and functional performance, essentially like a summary of those transition assessments written in the IEP, or we would look for the actual transition assessments in the student's file to see that they were done currently, dated prior to the IEP, and that they're in the file. So just to kind of get compliance out of the way, there has to be at least one transition assessment. That's what the minimal compliance is. But we know that it's so much better if we do more transition assessment than just one. And so we're going to talk about that, what that might look like. So again, there's got to be that evidence, and they have to be connected to the student's post-secondary goals. And that transition assessment, all that information leads to not just those big future goals, those post-secondary goals, but everything else in the plan has to align. So in other words, the transition services, the annual goals, the students' courses of study, and those linkages to outside agencies. And I know we haven't talked a lot about each component of the transition plan because we're starting really with the assessments this week, but we're going to go through that so that you'll get a really deep understanding of what post-secondary goals are, and services and annual goals and courses of study, and those are all the components, and we'll talk about those. But just know that there has to be alignment. So if we do a good job with transition assessments, then the rest of the components of the transition plan will flow and align if we have that rich data. All right, so I don't know if you've seen this cartoon, but I love this. On paper, we all, I think, sometimes write plans and we have a goal in mind, and then reality hits and there's all these bumps in the road and things that we didn't anticipate. So we want to really make sure that we help students and families anticipate those potential challenges in that journey to adulthood. So maybe think back to your own, transition from high school to college, or from high school into employment, and, and what kinds of barriers and things did you encounter, and did you have the skills, I guess, and the grit to kind of get through some of that? So I've talked to a lot of parents throughout the state that have said, my student had the plan to go to college and it was beautifully outlined in their transition plan, but then they got to college and failed their first exam, and then they wouldn't come out of their bedroom and they wouldn't go back to class, and they didn't know how to talk to their instructor. And so, these are the kinds of realities and skills that students need when they go to those post-secondary settings. So what we try to do is anticipate those and identify where a student might have some gaps in some of those skill deficits, like if they don't know how to talk about their disability, or they don't know what their accommodations are, that's going to be really tough when they get to college, right? So keep this kind of picture in your mind as you work with students and help them develop transition plans. All right, so what are post-secondary transition assessments? They're not just a one and done. They're an ongoing kind of process of collecting some data around this concept of SPINS. And also we want to make sure that what we're collecting is also thinking about the demands of what their lives are going to be like when school is out. So, socially, can they navigate kind of the social world out in the community? Can they navigate, talking to a professor? What will that look like on a college campus? Employment, all of those demands that are so different, I think, in the adult world than in the kind of high school world. So think about that. And again, we'll talk in a minute about like transition assessments are not big formal assessments in most cases. A lot of times they're informal, and that's why we say it's ongoing process, because things are changing. Young people change their mind all the time. Why do we conduct transition assessments? Why is it so important? Again, we have to know the student well, and the student should know themselves well, especially around those SPINS. And then we want to use the knowledge and from those assessments and skills to use to interpret data to develop that compliant and quality transition plan. So to be knowledgeable about how context and culture and language and socioeconomic status. So, every family is different. Their values are different. Students have different backgrounds, different support systems. So we need to know that information too, I think, to understand what we should gather. And it should be data driven. So we don't want to develop a transition plan if we don't have good information. And the only way we can gather that is through some great comprehensive transition assessment information. And again, I think the whole time we are going through this process of figuring out, what do we assess? What tool do we use? We always want to think about this context of how are we gathering information to help the student prepare for these three big areas, right? Further education and training, college, or whatever they want to do after high school, employment, and independent adult living. So that's kind of our lens that we are always looking through, I think, when we talk about transition assessments. All right, so we want to use multiple sources of information to help develop a comprehensive understanding of a student's SPINs. So why are assessments necessary? Well, I think we kind of established that. It's really the foundation of a plan. We can't write a good plan for a student if we don't have that great information. And then you might be asking, well, gosh, how do I administer these? Like, where do I start? And we're going to go through that too. Again, it's not a one size fits all. I think I had earlier written on the Canvas page that my experience when I first came to a school district was I was just handed this one questionnaire. It's like, this is what we use for transition questionnaire. And it was just one questionnaire that was it. And I really didn't feel like it met the needs of my students. And so you might have that experience, and I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong or bad. You can use that transition questionnaire that maybe your district uses, but I would really encourage you to go beyond that and really determine whether or not that's going to be enough information to write a quality plan for your student. I found that it wasn't, so I went looking for many other transition assessments and did a lot of trial and error. I would try one out, didn't really feel like I got the information I needed for my students, and I would go hunting for more. Then I started to realize, wow, they really couldn't make choices and make decisions, and I really needed to focus on self-determination and self-advocacy. So I went looking for assessments in that area. I didn't have a toolkit available to me when I was first teaching transition assessments. I kind of had to develop my own. So that's why we want to provide you with as much, resources as possible so that you feel like you are equipped to do this with students. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to read the little case study on Mary, and these are just kind of some of her strengths and preferences and interests and some of her needs. And so we'll talk about that kind of throughout, and we'll especially focus on this idea of Mary's case study next week in particular. But, just in a nutshell, she's a high school student, 16. She really knows that she loves art and design. She's super social. She takes a lot of art classes. She's in gen ed classes for the most part. She knows she's got some accommodations around testing. She has a learning disability. She's not super comfortable talking about her disability, and she hasn't had a lot of work experience. So those are kind of her needs when it comes to SPIN. So keep that in mind. And have you ever worked with a student, similar to Mary? And if so, what was your experience with helping her prepare for adult life? So if you've already been a part of some transition IEP meetings, hopefully you have some of this kind of experience. And if not, that's okay too. So let's think about or talk about her strengths. So think about Mary, she knows she loves art. She knows she's a people person. Those are good things, but oftentimes I think when a student doesn't have academic strengths, then we have a hard time identifying their strengths. So here's an example, like a student that might seem like they're totally distracted in class and they're doodling, might be problematic in an academic class, but think about how that actually could be a strength for the student. So I just read an article the other day of a student who was a doodler, probably not very effective when he was sitting in math class or something, but it turns out he ended up having some of his doodles put onto a Nike sneaker, like a Nike shoe. So, how cool is that, right? So sometimes we need to kind of look at what might be a barrier in a school setting is actually a strength somewhere else, right? Possibly for going to art school or for having a job that is related to that skill. What are her preferences? So, Mary, certainly you can tell she's super social. She likes to talk a lot. So we probably want to make sure that she has, some sort of a job experience where it's collaborative, where she's working on a team. So that would probably be her preference. She also loves, art, as she mentioned, and she's also playing soccer. So she clearly loves sports too. And then what are her interests? So we want to help students learn to identify what they like to do for fun. So that's important too. We really want to get a full picture of their interests. And sometimes we don't know that when we just see the student at school. We don't know that they have this like really cool interest outside of school. So we want to gather those kinds of information through our transition assessments and needs. So we might know her academic needs. So we know that Mary needs some accommodations around extended time on tests. She gets distracted easily. She has a learning disability, right? But what are some of her transition needs? So in her case study, it mentions that she's not comfortable talking about her disability. Well, that's going to be kind of problematic when she gets to college, or a job where she can't comfortably talk about that. So that's a self-advocacy kind of self-determination need she has. So that's something we would want to make sure that we pay attention to. All right, the what and the how of post-secondary transition assessments. So, like I said, sometimes students' spins change daily, weekly. One minute they want to be a basketball player, and the next minute, they find out about some other career. Let's say they want to be a computer programmer or something. So they change a lot. Teenagers experience rapid change. And so that's why that idea of ongoing assessment, right? That doesn't mean we do big formal assessments all the time. It just means that we are having conversations with students, we're paying attention, we're kind of, seeing that they are dynamic and they change. So consider how you're ensuring the use of ongoing transition assessments, and it can just be a student interview, anecdotal information. It could be periodically, having them do a career assessment a couple of times a year because those things are changing. So just recognize that it's a dynamic process. So also it's important that when we kind of go through these assessments with students that we are comfortable interpreting them, right? And that's where that present level, that PLAFUP statement or that summary of all the transition assessments is really important. And also gathering information from other IEP team members can really help to get like a nice full picture and interpret, what are their strengths, interests, preferences, and needs around transition. So again, remember that it's a student-centered process that students can actually select, they can be in the part of the process of selecting what transition assessments to use. So let's say, the student has no idea of a career that they might be interested in, or they only know of the careers that their parents do or their aunt and uncle, right? So they can say, I would love to know what other careers are out there. And they can really help determine what kinds of assessments they might want to engage in. So let's say the student has no idea what kind of a learner they are. We could do like a learning styles assessment, whether they're a visual learner or an auditory learner. Like those are, great things for a student to know about themselves. We can also reach out to other IEP team members, like your CTE teachers. A lot of times they do some great assessments in classes. Career assessments, aptitude assessments, those kinds of things. We can talk to outside providers, maybe that a student is working with, or mental health providers. Maybe they've got some insights. So don't feel like you have to do all of this yourself. And certainly parents can be part of this process too. All right. So in Mary's case, she wants input from other people. She has a vocational rehabilitation counselor. She's working with a pre-employment transition service provider. And we'll talk, if you're not familiar with these terms, don't worry about it. We're going to spend some time talking about what these are. But the other ones should be pretty familiar to you, like a school counselor, an English teacher, her parents, her special ed teacher, if she has, other ones other than her case manager, and then the CTE teacher. So really this, again, like I said, we don't do transition alone. It really should be a team effort. So reach out. All right, the ultimate goal for post-secondary transition assessments for students with disabilities is to help them develop that cohesive view of who they are and then their future roles. Is really the success of post-secondary transition assessment really depends on their perspectives. So keep that in mind. And so how might that look? The roles that students would play could be, again, they could choose from this idea of transition assessments under certain domains. So let's say, they want to live in their own apartment and they're really adamant about that. Well, let's provide them a assessment around adult living skills and see, are they getting up themselves in the morning? Are they putting away their dishes? Are they doing laundry? Maybe we want to involve parents in some of this information. So, depending upon what they say they want to do, we might need to help them determine, well, let's find out where you are on this, this idea of adulting, right? So maybe we assess your skill level. What kinds of things are you doing at home and out in the community on your own? And is that really in line with what we would expect for an adult? Use the information gathered to develop their post-secondary transition plan. So students themselves can then, look at their assessments, the summary of their assessments or the results of their assessments, and together with you as a teacher can really then develop what their post-secondary goals might look like and the rest of their plan. And we're going to spend a whole week actually on this idea of student-led transition plans and student-led IEPs. So that's where a lot of this will come in. And what I've seen some teachers do is they actually have students gather an electronic portfolio. So once they have done some transition assessments and their transition plan, they can turn that into like an online digital portfolio. And that is just, some great information that they can take with them to an employer, to a college academic advisor, where they have information about their spins. So encourage that and focus on student-directed planning when implementing those post-secondary transition reference assessments. So again, we want to make sure that students are involved. All right, so these are kind of the questions I think you want to ask yourself when you're starting to develop a transition plan for a student and you realize, oh, I have to do some assessments. So here are some questions. What do we already know about the student around their spins? So let's say this is, beginning of the year, brand new student. You probably don't know a whole lot about their strengths, interests, preferences, and needs, right? Maybe you've worked with the student for a couple of years and you do know a whole lot. Great, but that's a first question to ask. Then the next question is, well, what do we need to gather? So, what kind of assessments will we need to use to pull some of those, some of that information that, that we have to develop an appropriate plan for the students. So how are we going to gather that information? So if we don't know what they might be interested in around careers, or we have no idea if they're comfortable or understand their disability, how are we going to gather that information? What assessments are we going to use, and who can gather that information? It doesn't always have to be you, right? It can be someone on the team. It can be a family member. It can be the student themselves. And then who and how are we going to gather that, right? So it's something we definitely want to plan ahead before the IEP. We can't do this one day before. You have to definitely think ahead and have some time, especially if you're going to involve other team members or send assessments home to families. You have to build in some time. And then, of course, when will that be gathered? And it needs to be done prior to the development of that transition plan. So the IEP meeting typically, right? All right, so let's take a look. Again, I'm going to go back to this flow chart a whole bunch. We want to start with all that rich information before we can build the whole rest of the plan. And so how do we choose assessments? So I know, like I mentioned, my own experience, this was confusing. I didn't really know where to go, and I didn't really have a lot of support within my district to figure out where to go for assessments, which ones I should use. Now we have available, lots of toolkits. So I would just suggest, and what I did in my own experience, is become familiar with what's out there. Just know what you can pull from. I mean, the more you have in your own toolkit, then play around with them, administer some of these transition assessments, see if they work for your students. And if not, kind of go back to that toolkit and try others. So become just it's messy a little bit, it's uncomfortable, but just become familiar. And then also knowing your student. So in other words, what I mean by that is, let's say the student has a very short attention span. You're not going to have them then do 100-question survey on the computer, right? You would break that up, or you would use one that's maybe only 20 questions. So, know your students, their attention span, their reading level, their auditory processing, all of those things. Some students with more complex needs, even if we show them pictures of jobs, that they still can't really understand that or generalize that. So we have to use different types of assessments where we have to maybe observe the student in a setting and gather information that way. So that's what I mean about really knowing your student and then matching the assessment that is the most appropriate for that student's characteristics. And then it's always recommended that we use multiple types, right? I mentioned that compliance says that you just have to use one, but really one's not enough, right? We need to have multiple because we want to look at all of these different areas. And we're going to talk about kind of the major domains areas of transition assessments in just a second. All right, so here are some more guiding questions too that I think will be helpful. So let's say you have a brand new student, you're like, where do I start? Let's look at some of these questions. So ask yourself this first question, or ask the student this question. What are their unique talents and interests, right? Chances are if you ask the student that, they probably would say, I don't know. But if you can't recognize what some of their unique talents and interests are, then you're going to want to use some assessments or some observational kinds of assessments, or reaching out to their family members, even siblings, to find out, what are some of their unique talents and interests, because that's really important because they're not always academic. They oftentimes happen outside of the academic day. And then what does your student want for the future, right? And I think making sure that families are part of that conversation too. Like I mentioned, in some families, it's like they're going to college, there's no other option. And in other situations, students want to go straight to work. Everyone kind of has a different idea of what they want to do for their future. So we want to answer that question. And then I think this one's really important, but when and where is a student at their best? And I call this conditions for employment. So an example would be, I worked with students with more complex needs. And what I recognized pretty quickly is I had students that just didn't function well in the morning. Like they would come to school just tired. And for the first 2 hours, they would put their head down and just, didn't just wanted to take a nap, and probably because they were up gaming really late at night. So I knew that those students, I couldn't do a whole lot with them in the morning. I had other students that were the opposite. They were just raring to go in the morning. And then by after lunch, they were just so tired. They really couldn't focus. I had students that if I put them in a job site, for example, like Walmart, and there was just lots of noise and people and lights and way too overwhelming for them, right? So they needed a place that was more quiet. So knowing those conditions, like where are they at their best? Is it with people? Is it outside? Is it in the morning? Is it in the evening? All of those things. So that takes some observation, right? Where does that student shine? And maybe you don't see it during the day. Maybe again, you've got to involve parents and family members to find out, where do they shine if it's outside of school, maybe. And then what are the options for the student in their community for further education and training and employment? So, if you're in a rural area, that might look really different than if the student lives in Salt Lake City, right? Like there's just a lot more options around post-secondary education and employment in the cities. Not to say that there aren't, other unique options, I think, in rural settings. But again, does the student know all the things that are available to them? Does the family know that? Do they know that there are certain college programs for students with disabilities? So really kind of, making sure that they are aware and that you're aware of what those opportunities are. Because a lot of times students and families only, they only see what they see, and they may not be aware of what's out there. And then what are the students' barriers to a positive post-school life? So what I mean by this is, maybe it's a behavioral kind of thing, right? Maybe the student has a lot of complex behaviors that would be really difficult in an employment setting, and starting to recognize those now. Or maybe the student is painfully shy and doesn't want to talk to anyone, and that's going to be a barrier to employment. So really starting to kind of identify, not to be like negative, but to think about these barriers and how that will impact them in that adult life, and start to kind of work on those now, like provide the students some skills, some support, some opportunities to kind of mitigate, I think, some of those barriers to a positive post-school life, right? Because we don't want people isolated. And then what post-secondary transition skill areas need to be assessed to determine the services. So what I mean about this, so the biggest part of the transition plan is this concept of transition services. And we're going to talk about that in more depth, but those things are experiences, skills, instruction that the student really needs to help them realize and meet those post-secondary goals. So really looking at the assessment results and saying, wow, this student, can't even talk about their disability. We need to do some instruction around understanding their disability, for example, or this student is afraid to cross the street, right? So we really need to start to work on teaching them how to do that safely so they can access the community. So that's what I mean about really understanding those needs around the spins, and then working on how do we provide them that instruction and practice and experience so that they leave school, with some successful skills to be a contributing member of their society, and then successful in all those adult type settings. So those are the guiding questions. And then domains. So you might be saying, well, gosh, there's so many transition assessments out there. There's so many on the Padlet you provided, me. How do I navigate these? Well, so typically transition assessments fall under these 4 domains. There are some outliers, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but we have a lot of them around employment and career interests. Some are online, some are paper pencil. Some school counselors and CTE teachers are already doing in your schools. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with what's called U-Science, but that's an example of an employment, a career interest. Keys to Success, that's one that a lot of school counselors use. And we'll kind of go through these in more specifics, but really we should be doing something around this idea of career interests and how the students' interests can align with career cluster areas, to kind of start this conversation about, oh, well, you're really social. Well, these are the types of jobs where social skills are necessary and valued. Or you're really detail oriented, and these are the types of jobs where that's valued and needed. So that connection between the students' unique interests and talents and aptitudes, and how they relate to careers. So that's kind of the biggest domain. It's what we see most commonly in transition assessments, is this idea of some sort of a career and employment interest. Then there is another domain called college readiness or post-secondary training. This one, there aren't as many assessments. You'll probably recognize that when you go on the Padlet. But what this does really, if a student says, oh, I definitely want to go to college, these types of assessments, I think, determine, do they have those skills to make it in college, right? Some of it is academic skills, like can they handle the load of a couple of classes and homework and the type, the quantity of reading they're going to have to do. But some of it is things like, can they send an email to a professor? Can they, advocate for themselves? Are they able to navigate a college campus, for example, get along with a roommate? Like, right, there's a lot of those things around college readiness. So that's another domain. Then there's self-determination and self-advocacy. So does the student, know themselves well, know their strengths, know their accommodations? Can they ask for help? Do they do that appropriately? So that's around self-determined self-advocacy, super important domain. And then the last one, we've talked a little bit about this, but this idea of adult living skills and independent living skills. And remember, this is not just for students with complex needs, but all those adult living skills it even takes to, live in a dorm, for example, making sure that they're, addressing their health and wellness, all of those kinds of things, navigating the community, doing things at home if they want to live in their own apartment. So this is huge, right? This adult living skills, independent living skills is pretty broad, I think, for all students. So those are generally the 4 domains. There are a few other ones, like there are specific ones around healthcare. There are some specific assessments around this idea of assistive technology. So like if a student needs like a speech to text to speech kind of technology, there are assessments around that. So if they get to college and they are given a device maybe that is to record a lecture, for example, are they comfortable with using that? So those are some of the outliers. There's also some around learning styles. So if a student understands that they're an auditory learner, a visual learner, kinesthetic learner, those kinds of things. But these are the 4 big ones. Now let's talk for a minute about the types of post-secondary transition assessments. Most of your transition assessments are going to be informal. So these are things like inventories, interviews, questionnaires, and some of the questionnaires, like I've made up some of my own as a teacher. There's also really great ones out there. I just found that I had to tweak a lot of mine. Direct observations, observing a student in the community, at a job site setting, in school, at a club setting, just trying to gather information through direct observations. Can they navigate, the building, for example, a college campus? Environmental situational assessments, those are often used in the community or at job sites. So in other words, does a student have the stamina to stand for 30 minutes? Can they carry things? Can they, communicate with coworkers, right? Can they put on their uniform when they get to work? Like those are kind of those situational assessments, we call them. And then there's curriculum-based assessments. So those are oftentimes like, let's say you're teaching a curriculum around budgeting skills. There might be a pre-test and then a post-test. And that pre-test, might be information that you can use as a transition assessment that the student really doesn't understand budgeting, for example. So that's what I mean by curriculum-based assessments. Now there's the whole category of formal assessments. Those are things like intelligence tests, achievement tests, aptitudes, employability, adaptive behavior. So these should be pretty familiar to you if you've done some 3-year or evaluations for students or initial evaluations. We have to do these formal tests a lot of times to qualify students for special education. So I would say for transition assessments, these are not often used, possibly the aptitude or the employability, and maybe the adaptive behavior. What I would sometimes do is if a student had a 3-year re-eval and they had an adaptive behavior assessment that looked at their functioning around communication, daily living skills, community skills, work skills, those kinds of things. If it was current information, I would sometimes pull from that adaptive behavior formal assessment and add that to my summary of transition assessments. But I would say we don't typically use formal assessments for transition. But doesn't mean that if you have current formal assessments available to you for the student, you can certainly pull from those, definitely. And, academic achievement types of things too, you can pull from there as well. So I wanted to make that clear. Here are just a short list of some examples, and there's a whole lot more on the Padlet. There's a QR code to the Padlet, but it's also, of course, linked on the Canvas page. But please spend some time. The Padlet it kind of goes pretty deep, but there is sort of a separate Padlet within the Padlet for each domain. So here's just some examples, right? You'll see some college readiness surveys on there. You'll see a career cluster, learning styles assessment, situational assessments. There's some self-determination checklists on there. And there are some health readiness assessments on there too. So again, just a very short list. The sky's the limit. I always say it's kind of a blessing and a curse how many transition assessments there are out there, because it's a bit daunting, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we have a lot to pull from because it is not a one size fits all. Now, if you're working with students with more complex needs, maybe students that don't use verbal communication or have a lot of physical barriers, we tend to have to use different types of assessments. One of my favorites is called the Positive Personal Profile, and it is on the Padlet on the column that's headed Students with More Complex Needs. And that one is really, again, trying to gather that information from family members. This is a great one to send home that asks, all of these little nuggets, I call them, all of these little positive things, about a student that maybe we don't know that they love to do, or that they, can do at home. And so that positive personal profile is really just a simple one pager that talks about, who does a student like to be with? Where are they the most comfortable? What are their favorite things? What do they like? What's their favorite environment? All of those kinds of things. And then the life skills assessment tool, the second one on this list, is also just kind of a quick one pager of kind of the most essential skills around adult living and independent living. So that's a really great one to use too. And it's like a Likert scale. So the student like always does this, sometimes does this, never does this. So it's very simple to fill out. There's some other ones called personal preference indicators and employment support indicators. That's also on the Padlet. I used to use those a lot with my students with more complex needs, just to find out, especially when I had a student that, like I said, didn't use verbal communication. I had a student that was, in a wheelchair. I was just trying to get an idea of, what did the person prefer? And so I would use that I would send it home oftentimes to family members, and they would fill it out. And it was very simple for them to fill out, but it gave me lots of information. Employment support indicators, that one is really for a student with more complex needs. That is, you're starting to get ready to think about work for that student. And it's really about what kinds of supports would they need on the job. And so it asks lots of questions around that. And then there's one called the ARC self-determination scale. And this is one that you would fill out possibly with a family member to find out really about how self-determined the student is, even if they don't have verbal skills. So what I mean by that is, do they get to make choices about what they wear, about what they eat, about where they go, about who they hang out with, all those kinds of things. So that's what that self-determination scale is. That one is really built for students with intellectual disabilities and more complex needs that can't really verbalize some of their concepts around self-determination. So that's just quickly in a nutshell, some specific assessments I think that are more appropriate for students with complex needs. All right, just a quick note about involving families. Have you had, any experience with reaching out to families and involving them in transition skills? Just some ideas. You could send home assessments for family members to fill out, like I mentioned. I've also, just gotten family members on the phone and gone through different assessments with them. But it's really important, I think, to get the family perspective, and you can learn a lot from families, and I think they feel more involved in the entire process. So, all right, I just have realized that I was trying to keep this short, and it really isn't short because there's a lot to talk about. But this is the end of our introduction to transition assessments. I wanted to mention one more thing on the Canvas course. I did provide a link to kind of a new Padlet for our class. And that really is optional. And it's just, if you're using something out there that you like, or about something, throw it onto the Padlet. You should be able to click the link and then add assessments, or, you can put questions on there. It's kind of just our little gathering place for information around transition assessments. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. And remember, I'll have that open Zoom room on Monday afternoon at 4:30. And we'll see you in a week. Thank you.